Okay, good. So, welcome to Service Binding Operator Weekly call. Today is April 1st. We have one agenda, and if there is anything else, we can add that also. So, Predrag, can you take up that refactoring reconcile loop PR discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted practically to announce that this PR is ready for the review since last Friday. This is the major rework. I mean, just let me know to share my screen.
Uh,
You were saying something?
no, you are going to give a high level overview or something about the PR?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, good.
So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So this review, this PR is the result of work we actually already identified in the issue number 884. We realized the current code base is a bit convoluted, and we are starting to get trouble to submit new features, new functionalities. So in order to make the contribution from the external people easier and to have things which is more testable and easier to reason about, we decided to refactor internal or reconcile loop. As you already know, we use Operator SDK as the library, and there is a kind of notion of reconcile loops. Whenever there is a change in on the resources you registered for watching, so create, update, or delete, uh, you get an event in the event queue, and as a result of that, eventually a function called reconcile is called, invoked, where you try to modify the cluster state according to the change on the service binding. So far, we had one single package and a number of actions which were encoded like a pretty, I would say, imperative way. In order to make the reasoning easier, I propose that we break this logic into a number of stages and organize it in a sort of pipeline. So if you look at the issue itself, I draw some proposal here, high level proposal. The service binding comes in from the Kubernetes API. We create a context, and context is the only thing which is moved from stage to stage. Context has all information needed to perform the reconcile loop, so information of the service binding itself, but also gives you ability. That's the only point, kind of contact point to the cluster API. So via context, you're able to retrieve additional resources in the cluster and in general to communicate with the cluster, to persist changes back, and so on. And so we were able to identify a couple of stages which are part of this pipeline. So first of all, at the beginning, you need to gather the binding definition. So we have something which is called binding definition, describes where the binding data are, and then later on, when we know what are the locations, then we can then really perform gathering of this information from various resources in various places, and eventually generate some more binding data based on provided mappings, and we are able to adjust maybe the naming of those binding data if needed, if application requires that the bindings are called differently. Then we generate our intermediate binding secret, and then after that we either inject those binding data as environmental variables inside of the application containers, or as mounted volume. And finally, at the end of this process, we persist then those changes and all these resources to the cluster. If everything goes well, we are done. If not, we try to requeue and reconcile again. So that's basically the design we wanted to achieve. And PR tries to address this as a nice side effect of all this, given that we have now a notion of the pipeline. That pipeline could be also invoked and used even outside the reconcile loop. And this is something which is interesting for the people who are writing tooling around service binding. So in particular, audio team wanted to exercise the opportunity to perform service binding on some Minikube clusters, and even like without Kubernetes clusters available in development environments, by binding a service to application without even having a service binding operator running in the cluster or not having cluster at all. This particular new design enables them to do that, and so you can actually provide the different implementations of some pieces. For example, you need to in order to construct a pipeline, you need to provide a context provider. And there is at the moment one default implementation of it, which requires access to a client instance pointing to a cluster and to REST mapper, which again can be a fully different implementation if needed. And once you have this pipeline, then you can easily apply service binding to it. Additional nice thing what we achieved is that practically we have various stages now, and all the stages they do exactly one thing and nothing more, and therefore we are able to very easily perform very focused unit tests to them. I'll show you a bit of the code if you want. So like just to find important pieces here, just to give me a sec. There are a lot of changes there because we removed quite a bit of files which are not needed, and there is a big change in the vendoring part. Therefore, the changes. But let me see to find something. So, yeah, for example, here. No, I think this is not actually a good way to show. So I should probably open a branch. Yes, that's easier to show then. Right. So if you go under packages and then reconcile, and you're gonna find here the new API. The new API is just there's a notion of pipeline which has only one method on it, which says process me service binding, which was somehow created or received. So in the reconcile loop, we received them from cluster, but in tooling context, service binding instance could be created in an arbitrary way. As a result of processing, we get two arguments back. So one is Boolean, which simply indicates if the processing needs to be retried or retried again, false if not, and then potential error which occurred during the processing. The pipeline consists of number of handlers, and each of the handler implements a single function which receives context. And the context itself, as I mentioned at the beginning, contains all the necessary access points either to the service binding, which needs to be processed, or access to the underlying cluster if there is one. So there are various functions which need to be implemented, like the binding name, like a list of the services. We need to bind a list of the applications. We need to bind how we are binding either as environment variables or files. What is the naming template we want to apply, and so on. Also, the context is there to control the workflow or the pipeline processing. So each of the stages, each of the handlers can request to inform pipeline that retrial processing is needed, or if an error happened, or even like request to stop processing. In that case, the context will not be forwarded to the next stage in the pipeline. The control will be returned back to the pipeline. Then the pipeline will return control, inform invoker about the results. If I show you now how this works in practice, so how actually the controller now look like. So control got really simple. So first here in the setup part, as I mentioned, we initialize the pipeline. A pipeline instance is set on the reconcile object, so for the further usage. And here we simply use the operator SDK functionality. So we define that the controller is watching for service bindings, and that we are only interested on events which are generating change in the spec part of the binding. We even like say here, okay, we would like to have a number of threads which are processing those requests. So it's not just one single thread depending on the node. We could have we could have like more threads, and depends by default the number of threads is equal to the number of available CPUs. And later on here in the reconcile loop, we retrieve the service binding from the cluster, from the queue, do a bit of the checks in order to understand if the object is still available. If the object doesn't have any finalizer set, we need to set it for the future garbage collection. And then here is the major part. So what we would do here, we push the service binding through the pipeline, wait for the results back, and in case the processing was about on the service binding which is about to be deleted, then we also remove the finalizer. Otherwise, we here practically pack the results of the pipeline into the results which are understandable for the reconcile loop and return back. On the pipeline itself, you can, if you really want to understand how pipeline look like and what are the stages, you have this builder package here. And inside of this builder package, you, apart from the implementation of pipeline, there is a default pipeline here which lists all the stages here, which needs to be invoked. So we first start with unbinding. Unbinding will happen only if the submitted service binding request is marked to be deleted. Otherwise, it's skipped inside of the code itself. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we collect binding definitions, we collect binding items. Then we also look for the own resources, if that option is set in the service binding. And if yes, then we start to try to extract first to find them. And if they are there, for those which are supported, like secrets, config maps, services, and OpenShift routes, we try to extract some of the binding data and put them in the context. Then we generate additional bindings based on the provided mappings, if at all. Then we apply the binding namings if they're defined, and then in the final part of the pipeline, we inject bindings either as environmental variables or files. And at the end of the pipeline, the changes are going to be persisted back to the cluster. Any questions, comments?
Maybe a quick one. Just what are your plans and which release would this be in?
That will be definitely 0.7, which I'm still waiting for the final approval for this particular PR. But once this gets merged in, we're going to start the next release cycle. So
Great.
very likely after Easter, in that week.
Thank you.
Great review. I have a question. Is this something that you designed for other projects to consume, like the pipelines, or is it just something internal for the SBO?
What do you mean, like this particular architecture?
Yeah. Is it because?
I mean, this is currently only part of the service binding operator.
Okay.
But if there is, of course, the very same pattern could be applied probably to many other operators. The motivation for this was a couple of like the organization of the current code, and then like a request for the audio team and the others which would like to use the service binding logic outside to embed the service binding logic inside of their tooling without requirement to have access to a cluster or to have a service binding operator running in that cluster.
Oh, okay.
Anybody else?
Okay, I think if no questions, we can move on to the next topic, right?
I mean, anyhow, I really appreciate some comments or like playing with that and giving us back feedback on this PR, because we would like to merge this soon. And with that, one is, I didn't mention that before, but one additional really good side of this refactoring is the fact that we could easily start supporting the spec resource with the same practically unmodified pipeline. Don't think what we need to provide is a different context provider, which will from the spec resources bind compatible context, which will be then pushed through the very same pipeline. So the change to support the spec would be very quick and fast and easy to perform on this architecture in parallel to the existing API, so to say.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Any question? Any more questions? Or okay. So I can see John added one more topic. Let's move on to that. John, please.
Yeah. My question was this, you know how the service binding is used to connect to a service? I was wondering if anybody used it to connect to a service as a user or a different user, like connect to this database as Bob instead of Alice or vice versa.
What do you mean? Like, you would need a different sets of credentials, right?
Yeah, if you used the service binding to specify with what user you want it to connect to. So like to a database as X or as Y, you know, that makes sense.
We didn't, but I don't think. I mean, that's something which the, say, database operator or some database provider, there you would need to tell, okay, create me a database and put their summary in the database resource, or to connect the secret credentials valid for Bob or Alice or whatsoever. Do you think that information should be part of the service binding per se?
Yeah, it was more like an open question, like if the service binding operator was made for this, or because I noticed like in some of the use case the like the binding, the user was the same, or it wasn't separated from the actual connection to the database, if that makes sense. I don't know. Because I see it as two different things, like the connection and the user, but I don't know. It was just
Okay. I understand what you mean. Like you like you want to have a separation between the connection URL and the credentials you want to use, right?
Yeah.
Well, but then perhaps in that particular setting, you would probably would like to have a database with the only minimal set of connection URLs you actually bind to your application, and then you have a quasi different service you want to bind again. So a second service you bind to the application, which encapsulate credentials to the database.
Yeah, like create maybe two service bindings for
Yeah.
that, like one for the connection and one for the user credentials.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know anything like this or discussing this spec anywhere? Any idea? Any proposal there or?
I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't see any.
Now, since we are trying to closely follow the spec, and if this kind of use cases are there, I think we can bring it up there and adding the. Of course, we can discuss here, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think if any other question regarding the same, or we can try to wind up. I don't see any more topics here. So, anyone else want to speak about anything else? Any other agenda items? Okay, then we need a couple more volunteers again for next meeting. A moderator, and then someone who want to take notes. You can add your name there, or you can just show here. Would like to moderate?
I can moderate.
Okay, thanks. That's notes.
I can take the notes.
Thanks, Steven. Okay, thank you all. See you next week.
Thank you. Happy Easter if
Thank
you're
you.
celebrating and having a time off.
Oh yeah, happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Yeah.
Thank you.